I spent weeks using Claude Code and Codex to try to figure out which one was better to be able to share with you which one you might pick. Turns out that was actually the wrong question to ask. The real question is kind of which one thinks like you. If you've been using Claude Code and just wondering about this whole Codex thing, or maybe you're a Codex user and you hear everybody rave about how cool and how easy it is to use Claude Code, if you're in one of those camps, I'm going to give you a glimpse into what the other side is really dealing with and why it's kind of cool on that side of the fence. But if you're brand new, you're new to engineering, or you're using one of these but you still feel kind of unsure of yourself, I think this will help you understand what these differences are. And by the end of this, I think you'll know which one belongs on your desktop and maybe even understand a little bit better about what kind of engineer you actually are. Hey, I wanted to interject here just for a second. This is a pretty long video, and if you're just trying to get to a winner, I have it at the very end. That's perfectly fine. Just jump forward to it, and I'll TLDR it. It's Claude Code, but not for everyone. If you really want to know why I feel that way, watch the rest of the video. But if you're just looking for a which one do I need, maybe Claude Code is the place to start. I would advise the video. Of course. So let's get some of these really basic measurements out of the way. These used to be ways that we would compare these kinds of systems. And really these days, especially with these two, everything has gotten so close that I don't think that this is necessarily the battleground any longer. So there's performance, basically how they do on SWE-bench or some other score. And they're both not quite capping that out, but they're in the high 70s or mid 70s kind of neighborhood. So they're basically the same. And really my honest take is, as an engineer, both of them are basically excellent engineers. So I don't think that's necessarily a separation event anymore. The next item might be speed, like how fast they get their job done. This one I always kind of bristle at because as an engineer, I'm not really interested in absolutely how fast it gets done. Now, if you're going to take 40 days to do something that someone else can do in one day, then yes, I care. But if you're talking something that one model takes 2 minutes to do and the other model does in 30 seconds, the problem here is the quality out of the other side. If the quality is absolutely measurable and you would say the same quality can be done in a quarter of the time, great, I'm into that. But just saying raw speed, I think this isn't a real value to really talk about anyway. Use a smaller model, get worse quality if you want better speed. There's systems out there right now that are saying, look how fast we are. I would question the quality coming out of the other side of that. Okay. The third one here I think is quite interesting, but it's basically a veritable tie, and that's just of the last couple weeks. This is what I call access. Where can you use these? We're going to be looking at them as kind of CLIs. We've already seen what they look like in a terminal environment and how you use them. We'll be diving a lot deeper into that in just a second, but that's their basic main front. You can also use them as plugins inside of something like Cursor or Visual Studio Code and other systems like that. They both have nice extensions to be able to be used there. You can use them in the cloud, and this is where Claude just recently caught up by releasing a cloud system. So you can kind of issue commands to these asynchronously when you're on the bus or you're on your couch or something like that. Once again, another tie. And that really brings us to the big one. I will call this upfront a tie, and this is cost. Basically, both of these systems work off of kind of a token-based system. So the $20 model, you can get a lot of really good value out of either one of these for $20. If you're already a subscriber, dive in, you've already got access. But both of them are consuming at roughly the same rate. To me, this is just a tie. Okay, but this brings us to a couple of the items that I think are not necessarily ties, and they show the distinct difference between these projects. And this is where I want to talk a little bit. One is ergonomics, and the other is personality. Weirdly enough, I'm describing the difference between tools by their personality, and I think that's actually the differentiation that matters the most. But first, let's step into the ergonomics of the tools themselves, how nice they are to use, and what kind of offerings they have. This is a space that there is an absolute 100% clear-cut winner. Oh, yeah, so I have this great idea. I'm going to tell you what I think is the big differentiator between these two systems in just a second. But in the meantime, let's give them a side quest. We're going to give them the same prompt and let them kind of cook on it while we talk about what I think is different about these systems. And then we'll come back at the end and kind of compare the two builds and see if that differentiation is identifiable in the outcome. So first, let's actually take a look at how we're going to build this. I have 4 different terminal environments up. So we have Claude's on the left, obviously, and Codex's on the right. I understand this is probably maddening. So here we go. We're telling them to read through the files that they find in their directory and go ahead and build everything they can themselves. Let's let that cook, and that should do it. So we're going to first talk about what I think the difference between these systems actually is, and then we'll come back and see how they did on these builds. Okay, let me talk about the thing that I think actually differentiates these in a major way, and if this matters to you, you should hear about it. When you take a look at the IDEs themselves, and of course I'm in a terminal environment, I'm pulling up Claude Code here in an application that already exists. In both of these, you'll see this is Codex and how Codex looks. This is how Claude Code looks, so this is just the beginning step. You're looking at a command line, basically terminal application, and so they don't look like a typical UI, of course. But Claude Code gets so much closer to feeling like something that isn't necessarily a terminal application. It kind of helps you around. You can see it has multiple different disclosures with color, and Codex, very much like the engineer it tends to be, is very succinct and discrete. Here's a list of the slash commands. If you hit slash, you can look through the other slash commands down here, and it can scroll through them and show you what's available. Same thing for Claude Code. If you hit slash, you can go through the different slash commands. So let's ask very briefly to give a brief description of what this system does. Okay, what is this system about? Okay, and here's a great example. So what is this system about? This is how Codex returns it to you, very succinct. We're talking, I'm looking for the periods, maybe 3 sentences here. Definitely gives you a couple of the different folders that it's looking for. Now, this is not as intense as Codex can do. If I asked for a complete system breakdown or a flow diagram or a sequence diagram or all this other stuff, it can do all of it. But this is one of those things that we'll talk about in just a minute about the personality of these different systems. It's not just the CLI here that acts this way. This is the Codex model underneath that acts this way. This is very succinct. For example, let's go take a look at what Claude Code came back with. So these are the key features of the system, the user experience, the technical stack, the architecture highlights, a much more readable kind of definition of what's going on inside of this system. This is a clear distinction between what I'm going to talk about in the next section, which is one is much more of kind of a personality, and the other is much more of just an engineering system, is what they feel like. But what about the tools themselves? All right, we talked about the slash commands. Slash commands are much better in Claude Code, the way that you can set up your slash commands, where you might save them. You see I have some here at the beginning that are my own slash commands. Those are set up in a folder that's not inside of this project. It's in my global environment, but I can also set some other slash commands up inside of this folder and check those into a project. That sounds very obvious that I might be able to have some kind of slash commands that are just basically repeatable functions that you're asking for inside of the project so that anybody editing on it or me in the future, I'll have the same function to use. And then others are in my global environment. That is not the way Codex works. Slash commands and kind of all of these settings are only driven through your global environment. Claude also does a good job of trying to allow you to point out different locations that you might load these from so that you can kind of use a variety of different places to load all of your settings from. It also packages things up into tasks and subagents and other things like that that allow you to kind of either share packages of this kind of utility to different team members. They're really trying to figure out a way to make this application usable by teams. This is one of those spaces that Claude Code just runs circles. Claude Code also does great things like you can take a look directly at your context and how much context you're currently using, and it describes it very cleanly. But over on the Codex side, if we do the same thing, they are doing their best to kind of describe some things to you. You can definitely get to some definition of it, but these are the differences of these two systems. One's much more engineering specific and trying to succinctly give you the answer, and the other is trying to work with you like a normal application. So the environment that you're working in Claude Code is basically a 4 out of 5, and to me, Codex is basically a 2 out of 5. It is absolutely good. But the way that it talks back to you is always so succinct that many times you have to ask a little bit more detail, or can you tell me a little bit more about this or more about that? Because it will come back after working for 20 minutes and show you the change that it's made and just describe 3 things to you and say, the rest of it's done. And it usually is done. So I'm not saying it's wrong, but Claude Code will come back and say, here's the 25 things that I did in the 4 pages of scroll that you might want to read about it. That can also be overwhelming. But this gets down to these systems are there to kind of work with you and the way you need to work. And so that's what we really need to talk about. Okay, one more thing on kind of the UX, the usability. I just wanted to show you, remember we're cooking away on the challenge, the side project that we have going, and I wanted to show you that both of them had finished the analytical, right, the first task that we had. And in this is the output that we get from Claude Code. It tells us what it put together, the dashboard, what's on each one of them, the activities page, the technology stack, how to run it, how to start it, what the layout of the files that it created, and the key design decisions. If we come over to Codex and we see, okay, here's the next steps. By the way, the next steps that Codex offers are really fantastic very often. So this, I don't want to overlook. This is a really meaningful detail that you get in Codex, but you don't get in Claude Code. The testing that it did and how to run those tests and that it succeeded. By the way, that's kind of meaningful. Codex is also very good at running tests. And this is the implementation. And by the way, that's it. So it worked for 10 minutes to do this. Here is the output that it's telling us about. I built this. I wired this up, I crafted that, here's the polished surface, I ran some tests, here's what you might want to do next. But on the other side, it's this whole write-up about everything that it has done and what it looks like, what the files are. So there's a big distinction in the way that these things communicate, and you can see it very, very quickly when you run a change that's similar like this. Okay, so we've talked about kind of the usability and the UX, or kind of what I call ergonomics of using the system. There are other ergonomics like the extension that you might use in Visual Studio Code or the cloud experience. Those are very, very similar to one another, so I've kind of left them off. Kind of go take a look for yourself, but those are really so very close. They follow the same concept, like you'll get more readout from what Claude says versus Codex in all of these environments, because underlying all of this, what you just saw, the CLI, is what's driving all of these. But now I want to drive into what I think is the biggest differentiator between these, and it's actually weirdly personality. Okay, so what do I mean when I talk about there's a personality difference between these? And there really is. You've already seen it a little bit using the ergonomic lens that we just used, but comparing Claude Code and Codex, it's not about how good the outcome is, because, you know, these systems are variable in a lot of ways, so it's very difficult to get an apples to apples comparison of something. And really the engineering out of both of them is so high. They both are, like I said, the mid 70s and the SWE bench kind of benchmark, if that means anything to you. But they're both really very good engineering kind of systems. But the question really is how you work. And that fit matters so much. And in the end, when I was trying to compare these two things and I realized I can't possibly compare them, the penny that dropped for me and told me, wait a second, I can't ask the question of which one's better any longer. These are so close. I was using both of them myself on my own projects. I use both of these systems. So the weird thing is I'm not picking one or the other. I understand their distinct benefits and their weaknesses, and I will use them in the places that I think that they're the most useful for the task that I'm trying to perform. All right, so let's dive into this whole idea of personality. All right, the way I describe this at a very high level, Claude is, let's say, more artistic and Codex is more scientific. Really, you might see that in the readout that we got in the ergonomics. Codex is talking to you much more like a very succinct engineer that's trying to describe how did I solve the problem that you put in front of me. Claude is trying to give you a full output of explanation of what you might expect. That little detail is really what we're here to talk about. But I don't want to leave this as too big of a signal. So really, there's a huge amount of intersection between the art and the science. These systems are not that far apart. And in fact, in reality, they overlap so much that you would say, or I would say, Claude Code kind of feels like it has a little extra artistic flair, and Codex has a little bit of scientific or engineering focus. And really we'll see that in a way that Claude will wander a little bit. Claude will kind of make tangential changes and kind of have collateral damage to some degree. Every now and then you ask it to do something and it does other things also that you weren't necessarily asking for, whereas Codex very rarely does those. So Codex will very deeply solve a problem from beginning to end, and Claude will miss some of those things, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But Claude will kind of explore on the edges. And in that one detail is probably the biggest distinction between these two systems. Codex, and I don't want to say this too broadly or too strongly because they are so close to one another. This intersection is huge. Codex will stick to the task that you've given it more specifically. Claude Code will wander and explore and basically create. So Claude is a little bit more creative. Codex is a little bit more specific. It will absolutely run the tests. It will always check lint. It will do all of these things for me that Claude will forget. It will forget to run linting. It will forget to run the tests, even though I might have asked it in kind of the request that I put in, but it will wander around a little bit and say, oh, but maybe you also meant to update this. You're changing the drop menu to look like this. I'll also change the buttons that will share the same styling so that they'll be similar. Codex will not do that. It will change the drop menu and I will have to come back and say, well, the drop menu now looks like this, but the buttons don't look like this. And that kind of comparison is the difference, I think. All right, another thing that I will say about kind of this personality is Claude Code will work on what you're asking it to work on. It will notice other shiny things. It's kind of like a puppy is the way that I describe Claude Code, is it absolutely will go get the ball. It'll get the ball. If there's another ball, it might also pick up the other, or it'll drop the first ball and it'll try to figure out how to bring both the balls, and then it's going to pick one of the balls, and one of the ball, you will get a ball back. Which ball you get back, not really sure. Often when I ask for a change, it will go make that change. It may make other changes. It does not always do that. I'm not kind of representing that Claude will constantly create ancillary changes. It's not that, but it will make that leap more often. But it will kind of fix the problem that I've asked it to fix without necessarily noticing upstream or downstream impacts that it might have. Whereas when I talk about something like Codex doing the same thing, Codex will take that same request, make the change that I needed it to make, but also notice upstream, oh, I no longer need some of these constants because we've removed them from that in this last change. And also downstream, you might have more impacts. Let me go make sure that I check those. It's kind of a more holistic version of engineering to me, where Claude Code will wander a little bit and kind of explore and get lost every now and then. In fact, that is a real distinction in my head in how they're used. I expect a little bit more loss when I use Claude Code, meaning, hey, can you go do this one thing and maybe also make sure X? It's going to forget one of those two sometimes, maybe 5% of the time now. It's not all the time at all. Codex will almost never forget those things these days. It feels like Codex will absolutely do what you've asked it to do, but it will not look around and fix the other things that you're thinking are obvious. Okay, and so what does that really mean? To me, what I would say is Claude Code is what I use when I'm exploring or I kind of want to mention a kind of change and it will kind of propagate that throughout the system. Codex is the system that I use when I'm trying to build an end-to-end kind of solution or solve a specific problem. In fact, I have examples where Claude Code will spin and spin. I worked multiple hours the other day trying to get Claude Code to solve a problem that is a problem as an engineer I've had many times, and I understand how complex it is to find. So I started walking it into the solution saying, well, maybe check this other area to see if it would find it doing that, and it didn't. And then I'd say, well, okay, maybe put logging in so you can see what's going on. And it didn't know how to run the system to be able to see the logging correctly. So I had to give it the logs back every single time. And I said, well, okay, how about if you remove all of the extraneous parts and you just leave in the first and the last change, does it still occur? And it noticed that these problems still existed, but it couldn't understand the impact between them. In fact, so much so that Claude came back at one point, I was sharing screenshots with it saying, no, you can see here that it's not doing what you are saying it's doing. It kept coming back saying, I've solved it. In fact, that's like one of the driving forces of Claude Code, the puppy. I have solved it. I'm glad you showed me that problem. It was a problem. I'm finished. I found the root cause. It's fixed. and it's not fixed. And I would send it a screenshot saying, nope, it's still this. Here's the logging. You can tell it's this. It actually came back at some point and said, no, I think you're wrong. I think you're taking a screenshot of it when it's just flashing that, and it's actually turning into something else. In fact, I'll tell you, it was a dark mode versus light mode theming issue, which is kind of at a substrate problem. There's a much deeper problem causing the thing, but it was super clear to tell, do I end up in light mode or dark mode? It's supposed to go to dark mode. We're ending up in light mode, and Claude Code was coming back saying, no, I understand your screenshot shows a white mode, but I think that's just a flash of white while it's moving to dark. So I don't think that's really the case. And I had to go back and say, no, trust me, this is actually the final state. Can you go write some playwright tests and verify it yourself? It never really could. I brought Codex into the game. It worked for about 20 minutes. It worked all the way through, writing multiple tests, failing at those tests, evaluating the logs, never came back to me, solved the problem entirely until it was done, and gave me basically a small paragraph saying, oh, well, I noticed this was the problem, so I fixed that. And that's a great example to me of when I use each one of them. So it's not Claude Code can't do things or is not as good at engineering. It's just got different skills. And that comes back to the question of what kind of engineer are you? So first, let's check in on our challenge that we gave it to see if this behavior and this personality kind of shines through in the actual results. Okay, so our side quest is complete. Let's take a look at the results here. So all 4 of our systems have completed, and I've gone and created a server for each one of those. What I'm going to do, this is going to get confusing because there's 4 different things to share. Some of them are from Claude and some of them are from Codex. So I'll show the Claude one first and then flip over to the Codex similar example. So this is the Claude analytical dashboard. They're all running off the same data, by the way. It gets some run activity that I have that I've exported from my environment, and it gives me kind of a readout of here's the different activities. I might be able to go in and select only certain activities or search for them. What trends do I have? And so, by the way, again, this is Claude. This looks kind of great, right? If you ask me, this looks really, really great. I would love to have this system. I guess I do have this system, which is just kind of crazy. All right. And then the different activities, different dashboard. As you scroll around on the dashboard, you have current activities, et cetera, et cetera. Let's take a look at Codex's version of this same thing. So this is the analytical from Codex. And I will say, by the way, right away, hey, this looks really, really good. Very interesting. Has a nice chart for me to use here. I cannot seemingly move as easily into different activities. They just have it all mostly on one page. So I'm guessing paging through the different activities down here is their idea. Pace versus distance, heart rate distributions. Still really very, very good. I think I prefer the Claude one, but honestly, there's a certain amount of kind of big bubblegum version of icons and things like that. This gets back to some behaviors that Claude has versus what Codex has. Codex being just a little bit more, I don't know, sophisticated, more engineering specific. So, okay, let's take a look at the other one. All right, again, here we are on Claude, and this one was actually to try to motivate people, not to dive through your data. The intention wasn't to kind of allow you to dive through all the data and shuffle through it. It was much more keep you motivated, show you your streaks. Very simple kind of request that I put into this. Same data. So I have a 2-day streak for running. That's great. 4 days this week. I'm doing great. Thank you. I appreciate it, Claude. My weekly distance, averages. Here's what it's looked like. All-time stats. Excellent. So this really, it would take me a second to puzzle through what exactly it's trying to tell me, but it does look pretty attractive. I do kind of, they've called it run motive as well. That's nice. My motivational running system. How much rowing? No rowing. Not a surprise. All right, let's take a look at what Codex did. And I will say Codex really knocked it out of the park here. Very different, completely different perspective on the same problem. Here's my weekly goal versus what I've done. My consistency score is kind of specific. I have a 57% consistency. 2-day streak, 30 days this month, 1-day run, reset the tempo with the next run. So it's a little more difficult for me to understand what it's trying to tell me, but they definitely worked on design here. This is a very different styling. They're not just stealing a very simple style. And in fact, I will say Codex or Claude Code used what looks like a very, very similar styling between the two. So I wanted to represent this way so that you could see, if you go with Claude Code, when I say it's artistic, it doesn't mean it's the one that'll make something look good, or it's the only one that can make something look good, or anything like that. Codex is fantastic at this kind of stuff as well, but as we saw on the analytical one, it's a bit more analytical. Even on the run momentum one, I'm having to read between the lines a little bit. Now, had I given it clear instructions for any of these features, which I intentionally did not, it absolutely would have nailed each one of them. It doesn't have a problem doing it. It's just whether or not it knows to wander and explore in that same way. It's not quite the same puppy dog. Okay, so here we are at the very end after a lot of non-comparisons, sort of. And I want to say one thing very, very clearly. Claude Code, Codex, extremely similar. You do not have to worry about what's on the other side and should I jump over to the other the other yard over the fence kind of thing. That's not necessary. Claude Code as an IDE, as a system, the way it's usable in your environment actually has a little bit more functionality in it. So you might want to kind of take a look at some of the things Claude Code does. I share those kinds of things on the channel pretty regularly to be able to say, here's some of the things that Claude Code is doing that Codex is not. But that doesn't mean that you need them just because they're doing them. So with that, knowing that they're super similar, my actual takeaway that I would say is dependent upon your style. If you like to kind of be very specific about the way you ask for things, or you don't want wandering and you want it to only do one thing, it's clear cut. Go with Codex, start there, give it a shot. If it's not quite doing what you want, try out Claude Code from time to time. If, and this is a big if, and I think this one actually covers a lot of people in this space, and it's the reason that I even use Claude Code, and I actually have skills in all of these areas. If you're an engineer and you're not great at UI, you need to take a look at Claude Code. If you've always been one of those engineers, and I know a lot of you who say, I don't know, do UI, I don't do any of that stuff. I just do the engineering. Somebody else's problem. Claude Code can actually help you in this space. It's creative. It will help give you ideas. It's very valuable there. If you're a new engineer, meaning not just in the new engineering space, congratulations, we're all working in the new engineering space. The question is, if you don't have an engineering background, which means you don't necessarily know all of the moving parts of engineering and how to ask for them, Claude Code is also for you. And so this distinction of Claude Code will cover ground you did not ask for. It will interpolate what you've asked for. It can be irritating, especially to an engineer who's trying to get one thing done and other things happen to also get done. That can be kind of irritating. But if you don't know your surface area all that well, be it engineering or UI, Claude Code definitely has your back in this space. And so I have to call a winner here, which is if you've never started on this or you're really trying to figure out which one should I be in, I would say Claude Code is the clear winner because it covers ground that you might not be an expert or have deep sophistication in. It is trying to do all of it. Codex is trying to do what you ask. Now, if you know how to ask for all of these different moving parts, UI or engineering or deep depth, all of those things, Codex can do perfectly well. So, all right, that's my outcome is I'm going to have to call it for Claude Code. Weirdly, it's not a tie, but really you're not missing anything if you're in one or the other. So don't worry about it. All right, this one was pretty long. Thanks for coming along for the ride on this one, and I'll see you in the next one.